2024 marks the 40th birthday of the Peugeot 205 GTI, one of only a handful of hot hatches so highly regarded that they're still held as a high watermark whenever any manufacturer, never mind Peugeot, has the gall to bring us a new hot hatch. So in celebration of this anniversary, today on TwinCam, we are going to explore how and why this little car became the gold standard. Before we get into it though, this car is to be auctioned by Manor Park Classics. So if you'd like to get your hands on one of the finest driver's cars ever made, then please do follow the link in the description. But to begin with, we're going to need a bit of a history lesson. It's commonly said that the 205 saved Peugeot, and that's a totally fair point to make, but I also think it would be fair to say that it's sometimes overstated. And to figure out why, we need to take a look at its predecessor, the Peugeot 104, which was launched at the climax of the first generation Super Mini in 1972. This little fella was up against the likes of the Fiat 127, the Honda Civic and Renault 5, and though almost forgotten today, Peugeot managed to shift over 1.6 million of them. It was a successful car, but compare that to its arch rival, and the Renault 5 was produced around 5.5 million times. Clearly, Peugeot had to emulate the success of their neighbours, but hold that thought, because simultaneously, Peugeot was becoming Frankenstein's monster. In 1976, they bought Citroën, followed by Chrysler Europe in '78, formerly Roots and Simca. When compared to their state-owned rivals, therefore, they were hemorrhaging money and only shifting a fraction of their volume. But its effect was to allow them to grow out of their comfort zone and into a new image that the 205 would pioneer. But back to the thought we held, and this little car was born to beat Renault at their own game, all while benefiting from Peugeot's newly formed empire. When it debuted in 1983, the basic 205 was one of the first second-generation Super Minis, growing both larger and more refined than anything that had come before. But something else that came with it was the immediate intention of building a hot hatch. In the era of the 104, hot hatches weren't all that popular, and their potential certainly wasn't being realised. Most famously, the class above saw Volkswagen launch the Golf GTI in 1976, but in the Super Mini class there was already the Auto Bianchi A112 Abarth and the Fiat 127 Sport. But this pair's 70 horsepower engines weren't quite on the same page as the Mini Cooper S from the decade before, and wouldn't you believe it, Renault were the ones who swooped in, gracing us with the Renault 5 Alpine, a genuine rocket of a car that came bristling with 93 brake horsepower, later upped to 110 brake horsepower in the Alpine Turbo. Just as we saw with the basic Peugeot 205, Renault were the ones to beat, laying the foundations for the flashiness of Ford's Fiesta XR2 and Austin Rover's MG Metro Turbo in the early 1980s. This was the scene that birthed the 205 GTI, one where not just performance, but red accents and showroom appeal rose to the top of many a manufacturer's agenda. Only a year on from the 205's launch, Peugeot dropped in its 1600cc XU engine, the one that debuted only 2 years prior in the Citroën BX, and the rest is history. But as I alluded to at the beginning, I want to frame this video slightly differently from usual and work out why, above all others, it's the 205 GTI that we hold as that gold standard. After all, the 1980s are widely viewed as the heyday for the hot hatch, and in the decade after, we saw the 106 GTI and 306 GTI 6. So why, above all these others, is this still the one we dream of? Well, as far as I can work out, there are 4 elements to the deity that we know as a Peugeot. And the first one is really quite obvious, and it's the styling. Looking back from 2024, the 205 looks simple and even conservative. But in 1984, it was anything but. No small car looked anywhere near as characterful as this, so neat in its detailing with the obscured roof gutters, filled out stance and incredibly well integrated bumpers. I mean, the Metro still had metal bumpers in 1984. Then we add the elements that created Peugeot's new era, such as the slab-sided doors, colour-coded grille and R-shaped rear lamps. Plus, on the 205 alone, that iconic C-pillar. I cannot overstate what a fabulously good-looking and recognisable car this is. And for a 1980s Super Mini, that's a supremely interesting point. You see, modern critics regularly fall into the cliché that all cars look the same, and they treat that as if it's something new. But in its pomp, Car Magazine ran a front page complaining about this very issue. Yet Peugeot were here, creating a dynasty of cars that went about style in a manner that would have been almost completely alien to most of its contemporaries. We're all so used to the 205 that it might come across as strange to say this, but let's take a few in turn. The Fiat Uno is the car the basic 205 is most often compared to, because back in 1983 they debuted together, and the accolades were initially skewed towards the Italian. Again, considering how we deify the Peugeot, that sounds insane, but that's the way things were, and the Fiat was styled by Giorgetto Giugiaro. Now, Giugiaro deserves all the love he gets, but I think styled is the wrong term when referring to the Uno, because engineered makes more sense. You see, all these body panels were not there to look pretty, but to deliver excellence. And that shows in that the Uno was the most practical and aerodynamic of all the Super Minis. On the other end of the scale, we have cars like the Austin Metro and Ford Fiesta, both of which were decent looking little things, but neither of which broke any engineering ground. They were conservative, almost industrial, and that was fine. But back in 1972, here we go again, we met the Renault 5. By far the chicest of all the first generation Super Minis, Michel Bouet's design proved that economy and style were not diametrically opposed, and I think that the Renault led directly to the Peugeot some 11 years later. For now, we're ignoring all the flashy red bits, because even if you strip them away, the 205 is an exceedingly pretty car. And it's pretty in no manner I can really describe, but I know the vast majority of you will be nodding along in agreement. Yet, it's on top of this that we add all the bits that make the 205 recognisable, namely the grille and rear window shape we've already mentioned, plus the strakes across the rear quarters and boot. While you'd be forgiven for mistaking a Metro for a Fiesta, you would never mistake a Peugeot 205 for anything other than a Peugeot. This little car looked unlike any Lion before it, and its brilliance made it their template for the next decade and a half, leading us through the 405, the 106 and the 306, all of which were phenomenally well regarded for all the same reasons as the daddy of them all. But before we quite get to that point, let's address the flashy red bits. It's a given for us that red equals performance, but I couldn't quite tell you where that stems from. Certainly, the original Mini Cooper was markedly absent from the red stripe brigade. The Mini 1275 GT had red badges, but I think the stripes might have debuted as lipstick around the grille of the original Golf GTI. Other than that, however, the Golf was a rather subtle car considering its impact. So for the mainstream, it's cars like the Fiesta XR2 and MG Metro that really went mad with the red detailing. The Metro especially had red stripes on the grille, red decals on the doors and boot, red stitching and piping on the seats and steering wheel, red carpets, and even everybody's favourite, red seatbelts. But when stationed beside a 205 GTI, even a Metro Turbo looks like a bit of a joke. Not only is the 205 pretty, but because it was designed with a hot hatch in mind, the red accents are integrated perfectly into the bumpers and rubbing strips. Alternatively, with its stick-on decals and clumsy body kit, the Metro, and indeed everyone else, doesn't get close to the style of the French. That is element number one of why this little car became the king. Because just a glance over at one revealed what was, for a Super Mini, styling perfection. But appearances only count for so much, and we have Alfa Romeo to illustrate that. So for point two, we have pedigree. But back in 1984, both Peugeot and the 205 had next to none. Now, this is not a video about the 205 in general, but for this section we do need to understand where it came from and learn why this car was a surprise. You see, in 1983, reception was strangely muted, but by the time the GTI came along, the 205 was being heralded as a saviour, shifting the perception of Peugeot to the point where it's difficult to level it with the cars that came before. We all know the 205 in its ilk as cool and driver-focused family cars, but in the 1970s, Peugeot had a smart but conservative image. Peugeots were bought by sensible people looking for something practical and dependable, a mindset that would allow cars like the 504 to continue in production in Africa until the turn of the century. As you might expect, therefore, the Lion could lay claims to a smattering of rally successes, but Peugeots weren't cool. Not yet, anyway. But while this new dynasty of road cars was the catalyst, they were helped along by a certain Jean Todt. Before he casually helped Ferrari win 6 Formula 1 world titles in a row, he founded Peugeot Talbot Sport in 1981 and laid the groundwork for Peugeot to dominate the greatest era of world rallying. Making its debut in 1984, the Peugeot 205 Turbo 16 was merely a husk of a Super Mini, because under the skin was a purebred, mid-engine, four-wheel drive Group B supercar. Timo Salonen and Juha Kankkunen capable of mincing Audis and Lancias on their way to winning the 1985 and 1986 World Rally Championships. The deaths of Henri Toivonen and Sergio Cresto at the Tour de Corse ended the supercar era of world rallying. But Peugeot Sport continued to clean up, first at the Dakar for 4 years straight to 1990, as well as at Pikes Peak in 88 and 89. They were the undisputed kings of the loose surface. So what of our meagre 205 GTI? Well, these became popular rally cars in their own right in the production classes, but that's not the point. The Turbo 16 is in an elite class of truly successful and iconic rally cars, and I have no doubt that its halo shone down on the road car you could go and drool over in your local dealer. This is the centre of Peugeot's growth into true desirability, but for the 205 in particular, it all stemmed from the fact that it was an absolute riot to pedal about in. For decades already, the French had built a name for producing cars that were just fun. They weren't necessarily the final word in pure ability, but in terms of character and handling ability in tandem with ride quality, they were rarely matched elsewhere. But while other countries developed accepted recipes in delivering a steady character, the French were yet to catch up. The 205 was new for Peugeot, building upon lessons from the 305 and pairing front McPherson struts with rear trailing arms sprung by torsion bars. Now, if you don't know what any of that means, let me give you some more Super Mini context. In the mid-1960s, Fiat had a look at the Austin Mini, realised it was brilliant, and then improved it. Though by no means the first, Fiat standardised small front-drive cars as having McPherson strut front suspension. Struts are simple, strong and so versatile that you'd be hard pressed to find an everyday car without them in 2024, but in period they were still being questioned, and one car that rejected them was our old friend the Renault 5. The little Sank wasn't an all-new car, but at all four corners it featured torsion bars, gifting it longer travel and better packaging. Therefore, the 205 was combining elements of the two best first-generation Super Minis, while both Peugeot, Citroën and Renault built dynasties in the coming decades, all off the back of the 205's compromise. I'd dearly love to have been able to have driven this car today, and that may be able to come soon, so watch this space. But with the hype train showing no signs of slowing down, you don't need another voice to project the virtues of the 205's driving dynamics. Instead, we'll move on to the engines, because when the standard 205 was launched in 1983, it featured the same suitcase engine as the old 104. But despite being a carryover, this was an all-alloy overhead camshaft engine at a time when many of its competitors were using engines from the 1950s. Yet for a proper hot hatch, a tiny 10-year-old power unit wouldn't quite cut it. Instead, they took their new 1600cc XU engine out of the Citroën BX and slotted it neatly into the engine bay of their new baby. But in 1984, this was still quite novel. In creating the Alpine Turbo, Renault simply bolted a turbocharger to the side of their faithful old Cléon engine, and along similar lines, Austin Rover bolted a snail to the back of their A-Series engine, giving a final lease of life to these elderly overhead valve designs. To their credit, Ford went along similar lines as Peugeot would end up going along, fitting a 1600cc version of their Kent engine to the original XR2. But when that car was replaced in '83, it was fitted with their 3-year-old overhead camshaft CVH engine. However, the CVH wasn't all that well regarded, and as it only made 95 brake horsepower, it only matched a Metro Turbo, not getting close to either of the French offerings. But even if it was much more flexible than the highly strung Renault, 105 brake horsepower doesn't sound all that dramatic. At least it didn't until 1986. In the 2 years that the 1.6 was the pinnacle of the sacred number, the aftermarket had been busy. In December 1985, Car Magazine proclaimed the 205 GTI as the finest handling hatchback in the world, but only a few pages on, they featured a car called the Cheetah, a 205 fitted with the larger 1.9 litre XU, gifting these cars so much mid-range grunt that they could match a Porsche 911. But the key is at the end of their review, noting the existence of a factory Peugeot 205 1.9 GTI. And at the end of 1986, the car we have with us today made its debut, one that potentially remains the ultimate expression of what it means to be a hot hatch. The 1.9 GTI produces nearly 130 brake horsepower, and not only does that mean that it would still beat some of the smallest modern hot hatches, but like its silhouette sister, the GTI minced almost everything else on the market. It's no wonder that people compared it to the larger Golf GTI because it was just so much faster than a Fiesta XR2. Renault's all-new Supersank GT Turbo came close, but that car carried over its father's Cléon engine, leading critics to see only one car that could hold a candle to it, the Fiat Uno Turbo. The Italian may have used forced induction to propel its fantastic Lampredi engine, but once the 205 1.9 came along, it too was forced into the rearview mirror. But speed really isn't everything. In order to build success, you need to be all things to all people, and the 205 nailed that brief too. Without falling too far away from the GTI, the 205 had one of the widest engine ranges on the market, adding the CTI, a convertible version, just to flesh out the niches. In fact, once the 1.9 was added, the 1.6 remained on the books, being cheaper to buy of course, but also possessing a revier character, enamouring it still to swathes of the 205 community. In this regard, it's similar to the old Mini Coopers of the 1960s, with a sub-litre and full-fat 1275S to fill all the niches. What I've been saying thus far I don't think will be disputed by many. We've covered style, pedigree and ability in terms of this little car's success, but what I want to round it off with is dependability. A Peugeot 205 is more likely to serve you well than most other super minis of the time period, but according to popular conception, French cars aren't meant to be dependable. French cars are meant to melt the second they leave the factory, but I'm sorry, that couldn't be further from the truth. And in demonstrating it, I want to take you back to a point I made earlier about what Peugeots were known for in the 1970s. We won't labour this point, but in period, Peugeots were among the most dependable cars you could buy. The car everyone seems to reference is the 504, introduced in 1968 and built, as I mentioned, through to 2006. But the 504 predates the little 205 by 15 years, so we can update our reference to another aforementioned car, the Peugeot 405, introduced in 1987 and still being built today in Azerbaijan. These aren't indicators that they just couldn't be bothered replacing them, but that the markets that need truly reliable, dependable and simple motoring cannot get enough of them. So where does the 205 fit in? Well, thanks to Mr. Clarkson, the idea that Peugeot replaced the line of dependable cars with a line of fast cars is now within popular culture. But don't let that fool you into thinking they simply forgot everything. PSA are well known for their diesel engines, and in a small, light, well-engineered car like the 205, they are capable of moon mileages. Not only are 205s of all kinds still enormously common in France, but British diesel 205s are usually well into the hundreds of thousands of miles. And that trait follows through into the GTIs as well. While hot hatches do tend to lead more difficult lives, the strength of having a relatively large and under-stressed 8-valve engine in a light car leads them to easily go the distance. There may be some cheap materials inside, but everything is built to be rugged and to last for the 32 years that this particular example has. Not only is the Peugeot 205 a reliable car by anyone's metric, but compared to the average Fiesta or Metro, they're on another planet, and they don't turn to dust in anywhere near the same speed. In period, choosing this car wouldn't have just been on style or ability, but it could be justified by the fact that the Lion would go from strength to strength. When it comes to a car like this, one that isn't made of diamonds and doesn't make 11 billion brake horsepower, its image isn't created by doing one thing brilliantly. You can go elsewhere and find a car with more style, more practicality, more speed and even more driving enjoyment. But very few cars achieve all of those things while seeming to compromise very little on any individual one. Someday I'd like to make videos about the birth of the hot hatch, about how the hot hatch usurped the sports car, and about the art of compromise in achieving automotive perfection. Yet in this one video, I seem to have done all three of those. The deification of the Peugeot 205 is not something that can be explained just through numbers. It's something you have to feel and philosophize. And with that, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.